Greetings and welcome to Star Trek Discovery Pod, a sometimes funny, trying to be smart podcast covering all things new and sometimes classic Trek. Cheers to drinking with a child. I'm your captain, Mariah Gossett. With me on the view screen, we have
Clyde Haynes. Get out of my mind.
Got to get out of that mind. Paul is on an away mission. He sends his regards, and we will all be back together soon. But tonight we are wrapping up our Section 31 coverage, chatting about Deep Space Nine's extreme measures from Season 7, Episode 23. This episode was written by David Weddle and Bradley Thompson and directed by Steve Posey. Before we jump in, though, hey, you can visit StarTrekPod.co to find links to share this show with a friend. Hey, and you know what would be really great? I realized today, I checked, we haven't gotten a review on Apple in like 2 years. So I know our crew is tight. I know y'all been listening for a while, but if you wanted to go leave us a little love on the Apple Podcast app, or you can give us a rating on Spotify, that would be really great. It helps other people find the show. I know we're in the off season. You know, maybe wilding in the off season, maybe doing weird things. We go crazy. We got hot dog talk coming up. I'm sure other tangents to be enjoyed as we're waiting on more new Trek to come down the pike. It shall happen soon. So head on over to StarTrekPod.co. You can also find the link to the Patreon, where folks are watching a different Star Trek episode every single night. There's things going on in the chat. There's camaraderie about the state of our world. If you just need some place to vent, it's definitely a good place for that too. So yeah, you can visit StarTrekPod.co or patreon.com/StarTrekPod. If you're hanging out with us tonight during the live stream here on YouTube, which we do on Thursday nights during our regular scheduled programming, Clyde, how can people tell us that they want us to pay attention to something in the chat?
Just send us a message on Blue Sky and we'll see it. Because, you know, notifications and stuff. No, seriously. Do that. But also, if you're watching us live, then just type capital P, capital O, capital D, capital pod into the chat, and we will take a look at your musings, your thoughts, your philosophies, your theories, your hot takes, all of it. And in a moment, we'll say, hey, give me your cold or hot thoughts of the day by typing HF into the chat, and we'll take a look at your thoughts about this episode, Extreme Measures.
Indeed. Clyde, I'll ask Paul through our communicators later, but I was chatting with some other podcast friends the other day, and they were telling me that a thing that they like to do with their patrons is just like a loose hang in a Zoom, where like we're not recording anything, we're just chitty chatting, maybe having a cup of tea or other beverage. And so to our patrons out there, if that's something you'd like to do, if we had like a monthly just like hang for our patron members, let us know. You can hit us up either in the Slack or on the Patreon page. I thought that might be something fun to do. We could have, especially now in the off season, like maybe instead of a live stream, we just hang out with each other and talk shop, talk Trek, talk other, food items we're obsessed with lately.
Yeah, I'd be interested in that.
Yeah. Could be kind of fun. Let us know what y'all think. Hit us up. All right, Clyde, I think it is time for us to dive into, if I can find the button, who's got the button for some
Cold Freight.
It's an old episode. It's from the 90s. It is from, I was like, what's the exact? May 19th, 1999 to be exact. What were your thoughts about Extreme Measures?
Well, it looks like we're going to party like it's 1999. Oh, I think, I was watching this and thinking, all right, so I'm going to go back and I'm going to rewatch a Section 31 show, like an episode, after watching the Section 31 movie. And it was a little, Paul's going to hate this, but it was a little bit of a miss for me. I mean, it was probably more in line with, I think, the thought of Section 31, which is more espionage, more spycraft, but I didn't see a whole lot of spycraft. And I got to tell you that Bashir and O'Brien, if I'm in trouble and I need a spy to come and get me out of trouble, those two are not the spies I want to do it.
I enjoyed them as like kind of our bubbly duo trying to find the mission information, you know?
It kind of seemed like this was the spies who weren't spies trying to stumble their way through. From both of them, my expectations probably were a little too high. I think I went in thinking like, well, Bashir has some, augmented skills, and
Mhm.
Miles O'Brien is from TNG. So he's seen it all. He's been a part of it all. And then, and I was also expecting something probably like, I think in my head, I was thinking something more like Slow Horses meets Inception.
Mm-hmm.
And
Like going in the brain. Mhm.
right. And I didn't quite get that. But overall, there were some elements that I thought kind of worked and some elements I thought were like a little,
Yeah.
the payoff wasn't there.
I think to me, this was more of like, I think thematically what I expect from Section 31, in that we are getting, this is part of a multi-part, story arc in this particular season, where there is, stuff going on with the brain, there's stuff going on with Section 31, and then Odo gets sick, and then it's like, oh, it's actually a part of a subplot for a genocide. And like a lot of those things all feel very Section 31 to me, and like how we've come to know it. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Where it's like they're doing those things that we would compare to like the US's CIA department, like going in and meddling with other governments to the benefit of, the Federation, quote unquote. But it was the first time I've watched this particular set of episodes in a long time. And like, it felt like, before we got on, I was like, oh, it feels like the C plot got a whole episode. Whereas like, I had kind of wished we had gotten a little bit more of like, oh, let's go follow Kira for a little bit. And then we can come back to this, like she goes off on this really epic mission. Yeah. So I was a little, I felt like an episode I could scroll my phone while I watched a little bit. You know what I mean?
I know exactly what you mean.
But do you remember what do you have any recollection of what your first reaction was when you first saw this episode?
I was thinking a lot about that because, and I'm trying to compare, because some of these things, it's hard when you think about the fact that it's almost 30 years later.
Yeah.
And I think, so I was comparing it to like episodes that I've rewatched with things like TNG or Stargate SG-1. And what I realized, that to your point, that what makes this challenging is I've seen those multiple times between now and 30 years ago, right? Like you pull a random episode of TNG and I promise you I've seen it in the last 10 years. Right. And so I had to think back to like, man, when I watched this in 1999, what was I thinking? Right. Like, and I had to think I was in college. And so there's a good chance that this was on, and I was probably still multitasking because I'm thinking, for me, this was a story that's centered upon three kind of primary characters: O'Brien, Bashir, and Sloan. And I'm thinking, especially at the time, you didn't really have Odo, and even though he was in it, he wasn't doing Odo-esque things. Didn't have Worf in it. You didn't have Dax in it. You didn't have Cisco in it. Like, you didn't even have Jake in it. I was probably not that interested in it in 99, if I'm honest.
Yeah. I mean, I think for me, it was like, I'm sure at the time, I know I didn't watch this at the time of airing. I think I first watched Deep Space Nine like pretty recently, like within the last 5 years, really. So it's like, because I know Odo doesn't, I'm like, I know Odo doesn't die. So I was like, I bet though at the time, like the pressure and like the ticking clock feeling of the episode probably felt a little bit more exciting if you are unaware of like if you're watching something week to week as it's airing, you know what I mean? And being like, oh, I could see all the teasers, you know, about this being like, is Odo going to survive? Like yada, yada, yada. And I think it's been helpful. So I've been rewatching ER from the beginning recently.
Done that recently.
Yeah, I was like, I've been watching HBO's The Pit, and I was like, oh, I know where I can watch a whole bunch more Noah Wiley. So I went back and I was like, oh, because I've never watched this series, like I remember seeing it on TV occasionally, but I've never watched it from beginning to end. I am far more like, oh my gosh, what's going to happen to this character? Because I fully have no idea if anyone lives or dies between these things. And so it's like I can feel, because the pacing of that show I think is much more similar to the pacing of like Deep Space Nine than what we get in most modern TV shows. But like the drama build, I'm sure was really intense at the time if Odo was going to survive. Also, what a like very powerful metaphor for them to have for this particular story arc for Odo about like Section 31 essentially planning a genocide of a people. And like what a, you know, I'm thinking about like in 1999, I feel like everyone was probably a little bit more aware of like what had just happened in Rwanda. You know what I mean? Like there's like, I think a conversation was probably being had culturally that's being injected into the show at this moment. And it felt poignant. And there's things about this episode I really enjoyed, and we'll kind of jump in, but it was a little slow. And then also I think was missing some of the stakes for me because I knew what the outcome was going to be.
Yeah, I'm trying to look back.
Like Kian just said, it was like, it's very near the end of the series. So it's definitely a question who would survive until the end. And like,
exactly. So I was trying to look back. And the other thing you're talking about is you're talking about me 25 years ago.
Right.
And I'm trying to figure out, like, I was a very different consumer of television 25 years ago. And, you know, so yes, we knew that this was going to be the final season, but to Kern's point, the idea of like, did I believe that there was a chance that Odo might die? They weren't really killing. This was a time period where they weren't really killing off stars. Right.
But even just the last season, and they're like, or last couple seasons up in the drama.
Yeah.
I mean, they had just killed off Jagzia.
Yeah, and they replaced her though. Like, didn't they? Like we still got
yeah, we still had a Dax.
Yeah, we still had a Dax. And so that was disappointing, but I kind of like that I could roll with that. But at this time, there's no way I would have thought, oh, they might actually kill off a character. It's just like, yeah, they killed off Tasha Yar. That was jarring, and it felt like that was a lesson learned, and they weren't going to do that again. So the idea that because they killed her off, and then they kept having to bring her back. So and Odo, I don't know that if they actually killed Odo, I probably would have been shocked, and that would have been the lasting memory for me. But you're right. There was a sense of like this ethical dilemma. And I do vaguely remember when I watched this for the first time, that was a really big plot point that I don't know that we had really discussed or explored that much before, at least in the television and the sci-fi. But this idea was it okay, right, to take this enemy that was largely hell-bent on your destruction, and would introducing this thing into the Great Link that would ultimately cause them to die, is that okay? Right? Like that was I think it's for me at the time, I think it was an interesting question. And I would imagine, I don't remember what my thought was then, but I now, it feels like a much bigger question to me today, ethically. Like I feel the gravity of that.
Yeah,
in ways I probably didn't then.
it's like, there's so many historical things to point to. I mean, like even the colonization of America, like, and how much disease was used in that process
Mhm.
against the indigenous people of Turtle Island. And so it's like, uh, I think I can feel they are taking these questions we have about like this idealized version, like the idea of America, the idea of the Federation, and like what happens when you know about all the deep, dark secrets, and sometimes not even secrets, open history of how this country was founded and created, and all of the violence that goes into that. So that's really interesting that it's like, oh yeah, Section 31 is totally fine with wiping out. I thought Cisco's reaction to it was
Mhm.
like what I'd hope everyone's reaction was, like, oh wow, something sanctioned by the Federation is literally okay with committing genocide on an entire population, and the horrificness of that. And then to me, what's kind of funny is they're trying to like balance it with like Bashir being like, I'm going to use Romulan tech that we're not supposed to use. I'm going to use all this stuff to like get into his brain to be like, I can also use my dark and twisty ways to get the things that I want. But I was like, Bashir, it's like the lightest form of like, I don't know.
You know,
But I thought it was like interesting that essentially he's like, I'm going to use this Romulan tech. Oh no, he's essentially like cyanide pilled himself,
Mhm.
like Cold War style. Lots of Cold War coding and all of this, all throughout Deep Space Nine. And then he's like, oh, well, I've saved him enough that we can now go inside of his brain so I can find it.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me. I was watching another show where a character was spending time with the CEO of a company, a really big, powerful company. And the friend character of the main character said, like, look, I understand that he seems nice, but anyone who's the leader of a company that big, there's some shady stuff that they've done.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a take that I think is a take where when I heard it, I was kind of like, yeah, probably. But that's something that I think of today. Back then, that would have been a completely novel concept. And I bring that up to say that's what Cisco was getting at, right? It's this
Mm-hmm.
idea of like, here we are, we're supposed to live on this ideal, right? Like the Federation or America, like we're supposed to be this ideal. And yet there's this underbelly that looks at it and says, hey, we're the group that does the stuff that you can't stomach so that you can live the way you can. And then there's the question at hand becomes knowing what Section 31 has done or is trying to do. Like, how do you feel about that? Like, do you feel that they're a necessary evil, or do you feel like their actions are deplorable, especially in a time of war? Like,
Mm-hmm.
that's a nuanced and complicated question, and I kind of wish they had done a few more things with that question in this episode. But that's what jumped out at me in 2025 that didn't
Mm-hmm.
jump out at me in 1999.
Yeah. And I mean, obviously there's been so much more, I think, historically and contextually that's like come into the forefront of most people's knowledge about like even why we go to war for so many things, especially in a modern era. I think that is something I hope that it's like that's the thing where if we had gotten a Section 31 series, I think would have been an interesting thing to explore, right? Is I think the concept of war currently in society is so unnecessary and really perpetuated by like people's greed. We're not living in a time where we're literally having to fight for
Resources.
Like there is literally enough food and food on this planet to feed everyone, but there's people who monetize it in a way that makes it so that we throw that away instead of feeding everyone. So it's interesting to think about even in this idealized future. We have wars. We have the temporal wars. We have the Dominion Wars. We have the like. It's interesting that even in a future that's supposed to be potentially utopian, that war still occurs.
And I think that says something else about our culture, right? Like,
Mhm.
if this was a show that was truly utopian, it's like, could we even handle it?
Well, I think that's where, I wonder, especially with like Tawny Newsome and Justin Simeon taking over and writing a comedy. Because to me, if there is no huge conflict, it then just becomes interpersonal conflict, which is usually where things like comedies live
Mm-hmm.
over, dramas. Um, and I think, is Utopia a comedy? Is that where I'm landing right now? Is that a show that is truly utopian has to be a comedy?
I mean, yes, right? Because what you're saying is, if there's no external conflict driver of action, then it then becomes the conflict between people.
Mm-hmm.
And the only way you do that in a utopian society is it has to be funny, right? Like, at that point, you're not upset about the neighbor trying to kill you. You're upset about the neighbor annoying you.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah,
Like,
it becomes how do you get along, right? Because
mm-hmm.
like to me that is yeah, it would have been interesting to get there, but I guess coming back to the episode at hand, um it's everyone in this episode makes moral, I guess, plays on the spectrum of morality, right? Like there's the very far end of the work Section 31 was doing in this particular case, which is like the most extreme works of morality at play. And then you have something like Bashir deciding to use the Romulan mind probe, and then ultimately using, I wrote it down so I could get it right, multitronic egg anagrammic interpreter. Can you imagine being an actor and getting a script and seeing all the techno babble and having to be like, can you say this for me?
I mean,
it
would, especially early on, and I think in your career, or if you're first sci-fi, you just be like, what is wrong with you people? And then by your 7th or 8th series, you're like, yep, I'm good.
Yeah, whatever. Yep, let's go.
Like, I'm used to it.
I also thought it was interesting that they wove in the Tale of Two Cities as a part of the episode kind of plot point, because it's the haves and the have-nots, and sort of the story of the ideals of utopia as well within that particular book, and being able to be like, hey, we're still in the brain, this book's not right.
Right.
What would your brain look like if we were to take a trip?
Jeez, that is a loaded question. One, it would probably be on a ship, right? Like, if you were in my brain, like, weirdly enough, most likely it would be some combination, amalgamation of like TNG Enterprise E and Battlestar Galactica, right? Where kind of shinier like Star Trek, but more of, say, more offensive capabilities like Battlestar Galactica. But I think it would be this idea of like, there are a lot of places to go and compartments. And it's the thing I think about when I think of, both of those ships, is their hidden nooks and crannies, right? So on Battlestar Galactica, you've got all these weird places where people hide and have secret conversations, right? And then, of course, in Star Trek, you have the Jeffries tubes. Those would be the things that you would find that you're like, oh, I'm surprised by that, right? Like, things that wouldn't seem to quite fit. For example, like for the most part, I don't enjoy country music,
Mm-hmm.
but there are a couple Garth Brooks and Reba McEntire songs that I actually really like. Right? Like it's that type of stuff where you're like, oh, well, that doesn't quite fit everything else. And so that's a room that you stumble into. And then mostly everything else would be fairly structured and logical with, just like both of those shows, a fair amount of like romance and confusion and tropes thrown in, right?
Yeah.
That's what
I
my brain would look like.
I like that. I like that. Have you seen the show Extraordinary? It's like a British comedy. It's pretty fun.
I think that's on my list of things to see at some point or something like that.
It's good. The log line's essentially like everyone at 18 gets a superpower, and then the show's about the girl who at 18 never got a superpower.
Yes. I think I was going on a trip or something, and I downloaded it, but I don't think I actually watched it yet.
It's cute. I really like it. And in the second season, the girl with the superpower is seeing a therapist, and part of the therapy is like, she goes into essentially her mind palace. This is no spoilers. I think it's on Hulu. It's a really fun show. I enjoy it a lot. It's got a great cast, and her mind is like a bunch of rooms full of books, and so then it's just like all of her compartmentalized memories in these different books and stuff, and it's got all these different sections to it, and I think mine would just be many rooms full of books. Like when she's like, oh, this is what the inside of my brain looks like, and I was like, I think that's what mine would also look like.
Yeah, I might have a lot of holodecks on my ship where you'd walk in and just be like, what in the world is going on here?
I just thought, I was like, oh, that's a clever way to like visualize that. So I enjoyed that a lot. I also really, so in this episode, coming back to it, O'Brien just being an I love my wife guy the whole time was like, I thought a fun, kind of repeated joke throughout the trials and tribulations inside Sloane's brain. I did, however, at the very end, when they did the whole, like, they cheers and it was like, cause you love your wife. And he's like, yes. And I was like, oh no, are they still in it? Like I was like, check the book.
I had the same thought.
Especially when he got like the bullseye dart at the end. I was like, interesting. But yeah, I thought all the like, it was interesting to see how they interpreted Sloane's inner thoughts and feelings, like having the room with all of the family and his wife being like, thanks for killing him. Like he's never been around. I was like, woof, dark to be like, the only way this man sees peace is in death.
Well, and also, I think that's the interesting piece. So you talk about what would your mind look like. I think the structure is one thing. The true question would be, who would be walking around in these rooms and in this structure, and how might they act? Because then that tells you not so much who they were, but how you perceive them. And so what I immediately grabbed onto was, Sloane looks at, I have this wife who ultimately, because of my job and the way I perform, like, yes, we're married, but she doesn't care for me, right? She'd be happy when I was dead. Like, that's a dark kind of moment to think about. And so, yeah, that was one of the things that I looked at. I was like, man, even in his mind, people don't like him. That's a hard place to be.
It is hard. I also thought it was interesting that they were able to get Sloane in when, like, in it all, that Sloane wasn't really able to see that it was a bit of a trap. I was like, oh, is Sloane just like bored and wants to come in? You know what I mean? Or just investigate if this was true or not, and then fell into the trap. But I mean, to Sloane's point, from the first time he showed up, he thought Bashir would have been a good agent, and seems to be good at setting these little traps for him, at least. Obviously, because it is serialized Star Trek, they save the day. They get
Mhm.
the formula. I did think it was clever, the idea of like that inner turmoil being the two Sloanes and how one was like, I'm trying to tell you, but someone's blocking me from it. I thought that was effective. And then like having to continuously battle like essentially the dark side to get what they need out of it. But yeah, it was kind of like a lot of how many ways can we stop Bashir and O'Brien from getting. It's like we just had to set up enough of an obstacle course for them to
Mhm.
get to what they needed at the end. If they had to set up a distraction for you in that giant office full of pads to get you to not find the formula, what would distract you the most?
It's interesting because I was like, I thought the distraction of, hey, how to bring down Section 31, like I was like, oh, that's a good one,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because that, if you're trying to fall into this hero trope, that becomes the case of the greater good.
Mm-hmm.
Oh man, we could lose Odo, but we could shut down this entire thing. Isn't that
Yeah.
better? I think
And
for
what do you think's
me,
on that pad? Like,
I'm very curious. I think for me, it's like it would be hidden mysteries would be distractions, right? The unanswered questions, the things that
here's the location of Atlantis.
that would be a good one, right? The metaphorical who killed JFK, like that type of stuff,
Mm-hmm.
like that would be that would distract me in an instant. All the questions like,
Yeah.
what really destroyed the dino, like that type of stuff, like I would just be like, wait, just give me a minute, I just need a minute, I just want to read a little bit here.
Here's exactly how the Big Bang happened.
Exactly.
Like,
Right.
yeah.
So what does God look like? Oh, you got that? Like, okay.
Scroll, scroll.
Yeah, we way off. Like, okay.
Way off. All right. Biblically accurate angels really were what we were thinking.
Like, that's the type of stuff, like all those questions, I would be distracted. It would be like squirrel. I just have a handful like pads and books. Like, I just need one more minute. Just give me just give me a second. Just right here. And be pulling up and be like, just almost just what? Yeah.
Well, speaking of it, did you see they just recently think they finally solved the Jack the Ripper case? Did you see that?
I saw a headline. I didn't read the article.
Yeah, it was interesting. It was a guy that they had like brought in essentially, but never pinned it on him. But anyway, solving mysteries.
Cold cases.
One day they will finally take in Ted Cruz for being the Zodiac killer. It's a joke, guys. It's a joke. It's a joke. Don't take me in, please.
All of a sudden, StreamYard just shuts us down.
Yeah. Chippy, yeah, they did. It was like quite the talk of the town, and all my like true crime podcast companies I've worked with. Yeah. I mean, I guess, what do you think at this point? So this is really our first 3-point introduction is through Deep Space Nine of Section 31. And then it sort of like grows from here, but there's not as many like, I remember looking, I was like, how many?
I think there's 3 in
Deep Space Nine, but we were like, there's quite a few in Discovery. Yeah. And then there's only 4 in Enterprise. So really Discovery does the most work to build it out. And then also like Star Trek Into Darkness, if you want to go into the Kelvin verse of it all. But
that's why I thought a series was such a good idea. Because I think what Star Trek does is there's an author. He's in more the fantasy sci-fi part.
Yeah. Oh, I was going to say, I know Jessie Gender did a big deep dive into the movie, and in it she includes some stuff about like the books. There's a bunch of Section 31 books. So
yeah. Well, I'm not really thinking about those, but Patrick Rothfuss, he wrote the King Killer Chronicles, and it's supposed to be a trilogy. He wrote two. We may never get a third book. But what's interesting about it is, as he's writing, he tells all these like half stories. There's all these mentions of all these things that you don't really have time to get into. And it becomes like, so then when he wants to do like a novella or a short story, he just goes back and can kind of create these little mini projects that I see in Star Trek all the time, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's all these things that they introduce and then they move away from, and you're like, oh, if you really wanted to, you can come back. And so we see things like, if you wanted a whole series on Orions, you could do it because we only know a little bit, right? Like we've gotten more about Orions in Tendi and really Discovery than we ever got before. And so you could do that. I thought that Section 31 was prime candidate for something like that because we'd gotten little bitty pieces. And I say, especially with Discovery, it became so fascinating that you're like, what? I need more. And so just organically, it became this thing. There's a dozen of those that you could do, like when you and Paul do your Klingon Game of Thrones, which I like to call the House of Moog.
One day, House of
One
Moog
day.
eyes.
So I think there's a lot of that stuff. And when I look at this, I'm thinking they were just scratching the surface. I don't even know by this episode, I don't even know if they knew what they had with the idea of Section 31.
Yeah.
I think it was a vehicle to kind of do some spy stuff. But I think we start to see it evolve. And by the time we hit Discovery, it's like, oh, wait, we could really do some things with this.
Yeah. I think it's also like interesting, like the trends of like what's sort of popping off at that time, because I was like, when did, in the 90s, we also have sort of our resurgence of Bond is still like kind of going on. I was like, what era of Bond? We're in the Pierce Brosnan era of Bond, which is also kind of campy spycraft, which is like an interesting place to be playing around in. You have the Gulf War going on. It's like, what are the things that are sort of influencing the writer's room at this point,
Yeah, I'm wondering, like, when did the Naked Gun come out?
Oh, good question.
That was 88. Okay,
yeah, so a little, yeah.
And then 91 and 94. Just thinking, because you're talking about the campy spy, like I was thinking, like, what was going on? Because the truth of the matter is, if you think about where we are today, it's different, right? Like, first of all, not only has technology changed, but what we're okay with has also changed, right? You talk about the pit. My daughter walked in to the pit being on, and immediately she was like, "This is a lot of blood. This is a lot of blood." And that's true. And so you compare that to when you watch ER, there's a lot less blood.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. There's even a progression, I think, in ER. I think at the beginning, they're like a little bit of like, we're going to be shocking and it's going to look really accurate, but then you can kind of slowly see that fade for a while. I think like the pilot is pretty intense and then it sort of fades into traditional TV. But like, I watched an episode this week that's from like season 4, and it's like a pretty brutally bloody episode, and so I think it also probably fed into like when did I'm trying to think of like when did those TLC like Real Life in the ER, do you remember those shows?
Yes.
Like those had kind of popped off, I think, at that point. So I think like people were starting to become less and less affected, I think, by like gory stuff. It's also hard for me. It's hard for me to like. Jordan will often walk in while I'm watching ER, and he's just like, "Oh, gross," and I'm like,
"That's me." I'm turning around and walking away. I'm like, "Oh, nope, I'm out, tapping out."
No, I can eat breakfast and watch ER.
No, ma'am. But I think that's important to just think about, because it's the time period, the context is important. And so when I look at this and I'm going, and it's Star Trek, which has always been a tad bit more cerebral than it is action packed, at least at this stage. And I think there's some things that I'm looking going, they also were working with a fixed timeline. Today, if you needed 75 minutes to tell your story, you could probably get it, right? In 99, they were working with a strict time frame with commercials and that format. And so I think that's what we see. Again, I think this could have easily, if they had a couple extra episodes, if they had done this a little bit earlier in the season, there's some things they could have done here, but you can feel that this is kind of wrapping things up and headed toward the end.
Yeah, I was looking at like what was kind of going on towards the end of 1998, kind of when they were probably starting to write these episodes and, early, since it was May. I mean, it could be to early 99, but, like this is still when like the troubles are happening in Ireland. There's like the overturning of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. That's probably accurately what this was pointing to, is the CIA's involvement in Venezuela. The Iraq disarmament crisis. There's all kinds of stuff to point to. It gets real messy.
But that's one of the things I love about Star Trek is it taps into what's going on.
Well, yeah, it's also like the Y2K of it all is looming, I'm sure like all of those anxieties are there. Interesting. Man, do you remember how riled we all were about Y2K?
Yes, but I've watched a documentary on that and was like, if people didn't work really hard, it could have been bad.
Yeah, correct. Really but it's bad. Like, it was just so funny that people were literally prepared for like the end of the world in totality.
Yes.
But I guess from this version of Section 31 that we have in Deep Space Nine, what do you wish this informed what we saw into the movie?
I think, what this does really well is bring up kind of those gray questions, right? Like, again, you mentioned my favorite scene in this whole episode was when Cisco found out, right? So this idea of, in order to save a life, in order to do something that we believe in, we may have to do something that's questionable, and the tension between that. So, plus spycraft. So in the movie, I wish there was more of that.
Yeah.
Right.
I know. I felt like we really had a lack of like, what is the moral quandary we're dealing with beyond just the repercussions of like Giorgio's actions before, like the idea of the past coming to catch up with you. Like, cool. But what is like the bigger question? What's something that like we're all sort of dealing with would have been interesting. And more spycraft, like actual spy work.
And spy tool, like, so, okay, a couple of things with this. So, yes.
Right. Like, we all love the scene in James Bond where they go through, here's all your fun gadgets.
Listen, you regardless of who your Bond is, Sean Connery is the only right answer. But like whoever everybody does. He's
a good Bond.
He's also very handsome. But like, I mean, it was weird for me at first, a blonde Bond. I was like, what?
I do love the George Lazenby era though.
So
Lazenby, sorry.
But the star for me is always Q, right?
Oh,
it is the introduction of these cool gadgets that you're like, oh, it's a car, that's a boat that shoots missiles.
That's a submarine.
That's like, like that's always the cool stuff. So you have that. Plus this idea of like, what's the tension? Because to your point, chickens coming home to roost we've seen it a lot. Like, oh, I did this, but now I've turned over a new leaf. But that person who I hurt when I was the bad guy is still dealing with their trauma and wants revenge. It feels like that's in every series ever. So I could have done less with that and more with like cool gadgets, more spycraft, and some dilemma. And I'm trying to think of like what that dilemma might have been, but like there's an episode of Discovery where they were looking at spycraft, and I think they were trying to decide whether or not they were going to like destroy the Klingon homeworld, right? That had tension in it that I was like, oh, well, I can. And then this decision of we're the Federation, we don't do this,
Right.
That is what I was looking for.
Yeah. It would have been nice. I'm a big fan of Thunderball. I love the underwater bonds because they're just a mess. They're such a mess and they're so funny.
I mean, when I was a young boy, the more like the earlier, like really misogynistic ones were fascinating because it was kind of taboo. And then as I got older, I was like, that's kind of ridiculous. But
oh yeah, they are ridiculous, but so fun.
Absolutely.
It's like, when you watch early Trek, you know what I mean? When you watch like the original series, very similar 1-to-1 vibes.
Like,
oh,
okay.
Right.
Like that skirt, really? Why? What was the point of that?
Yeah. We and the leads love a blonde.
So listen, as a certified nerd, okay. I mean, I wasn't only a nerd, but I was accepted in that world. When it comes to sci-fi, I always have to look at the creators and going, I understand that this is your opportunity to see a woman in a short skirt, but get a grip, bruh. Just like, what are you like? I know, it's I get it. This is your moment. This is your moment in the sun.
Revenge of the Nerds was not far off from reality, right?
That did not age well.
Oh no, it does not.
That's so many things wrong with that one.
So many things wrong, but
I should never stream that ever.
Well, I think that's it for this episode, y'all. We have been talking about doing, I think, the OG animated series. I think that's like kind of the one we've spent the least amount of time with, and it I think has enough episodes to tide us over until a Trek series comes back. We haven't gotten any dates yet. Hopefully soon would be nice. So yeah, let us know what you think. Let us know about doing those like Zoom hangs, happy hour, tea time, whatever we want to call them. Remember to subscribe, rate, and review on Apple or Spotify. You can find links and more at StarTrekPod.co as well as patreon.com/StarTrekPod. We're also hanging out over on Blue Sky. Thank you, Karen, for helping to run the Blue Sky account. We've left the terrible place, so you can just find us over on Blue Sky now. Anything to plug, Clyde?
To plug. Not really. No.
Cool. Yeah. If you are in the Los Angeles area, I am producing a fundraiser for the Humanitas Groceries for Writers program at the Elysian Theater on Thursday, February 27th. So that will be a night. There will not be a live stream because I'm going to be raising some money to help out those affected by the wildfires in our writers and entertainment community. Shout out to Humanitas for all the great work that they're doing. Excited to raise funds for them. It is called And the Award Goes To. We're spoofing the Oscars. So if you want to come see a bunch of really talented creators and comedians, we've got a bunch of the people who are on Dropout. If you're a Dropout fan, we've got Dropout people on the cast. We've got people who are WGA nominated writers. We've got people from TV and movies and all kinds of fun places, UCB cast. It's a really stacked crew. So come join us over at the Elysian, February 27th, 7:30 p.m. Tickets are on sale. Help us raise some money for a good cause. So until next time, y'all, live long and prosper. Bye-bye.
Take care.